There's nothing like starting October with a good hot cup of apple cider. Hi everyone, welcome to Cafe Libellus, where I, Kristen, talk about books in the most comfortable way I know possible. Today, we're actually going to be reviewing 3 different books in 3 separate videos. In 1922, shortly before the end of the Russian Revolution, Count Rostov is called back to Russia. Because of his aristocratic status, he must live the rest of his life in house arrest in the Moscow Metropole Hotel. Now, this book came highly recommended on Reddit. I was browsing some of the book subreddits, either our books or our book suggestions, places like that, and I always saw A Gentleman in Moscow come highly recommended by people. It'd been a while since I'd read some historical fiction, so I decided to pick it up. Because it came so highly recommended, I had some high expectations from it. It is a recommendation from Reddit, so people always tend to hype it up and use some hyperbole when they talk about things they like. So I was expecting it to be good, but I didn't expect it to be, life-changing or anything like that, like some of the people found it. Despite my lowered expectations, this still managed not to meet them. Now, don't get me wrong, the technical aspects of this book are fine. There's really nothing to complain about. The overall themes of loss of the familiar and finding happiness in hard circumstances are explored pretty well. There isn't anything new done in this book to do that, though. These themes are primarily explored through Count Rostov. Because he is the one who's undergoing this change and losing sight of everything familiar to him, it's pretty clear how we might expect to see him develop as a character. The character development is the best aspect of this book. He's more of a down-to-earth aristocrat compared to other aristocratic figures in literature, but he still has certain expectations of the world around him. He expects to be dressed certain ways, he expects certain conveniences and the like, and he suddenly doesn't have that anymore. So of course we end up seeing how he adapts to his new circumstances. That's pretty much what the entire book is about, is him coming to grips with what he's lost and what his new lot in life is, and learning to live with that and learning to find joy in that, as hard as it might be sometimes. This is done in a pretty standard way in the book. You see him go through certain events and experiences and then see how he reacts to those things, what he learns from them, how he feels about them. That's pretty much how you're going to go about character development in this sort of book. The only creative thing I thought that was noteworthy to talk about was that Towles also uses repetitive writing in order to show Rostov's development. This wasn't something I noticed at the beginning of the book. In fact, I was pretty annoyed with how the book was written. There'd be a lot of repetition of things that the Count would say, and there'd also be repetition of feelings and events. It was something I got really annoyed with. But later on in the book, especially when the Count becomes an older man, you see some of these things that were repeated in his younger life come back, and they feel nostalgic. The writing that is repeated is then a callback to what was mentioned earlier in the book. And so you get a feeling of like, that I recognize that. The good old days of 30 pages ago. No, I'm kidding. It's more like 200 pages ago, but you get the drift. Now, the reason why I didn't particularly like this book is because I believe that this is a gross underutilization of historical fiction. The big draw for this book for me was the fact that it was set in a time of rapid transition in Russia. That time period was a time of intense change. Things were going so fast. Leadership was changing. Government policies were changing. A way of life shifted rapidly during this 30-year time period. And yet the book doesn't take advantage of that. As much as it uses it as a selling point to illustrate Count Rostov's development, it doesn't use it well enough. This book is broken up into sections, and each section is like an important period in Russian history. And it'll give maybe a quick couple pages blurb about what's going on in Russia at the time that this section takes place. But it's basic history. It's things that you would know from a high school history course. And then it doesn't even have any bearing on the story itself. It's more like setting up the setting and then completely ignoring it, using it only as a backdrop to what's happening in the Metropole Hotel with the Count. And I think that is, it's really disappointing. I was expecting there to be more conversation between the characters and the historical setting. That's why I read historical fiction. I want to learn more about the history of the place through literature. Having a character set in any sort of historical time period adds so much more humanity and context to what was going on during that time period. And that is why I love reading historical fiction. But this book just does not deliver on that. It's almost discarded. And it's really disappointing. That is my main issue with this book. A lot of Russian history and literature is used as a backdrop instead of an integral part of this story. Towles tries to put importance into the history as well as especially Russian literature, but it falls flat because there's no depth to it. Multiple times throughout the book, Russian literature is lauded and seen as something great, but he never goes into why that literature is great. It's almost as though he expects people to be very well acquainted with Russian history and fluent in Russian literature in order to appreciate part of this book. And that's just not the case. I really should have done a little bit more research before picking this book up, because I actually found an NPR interview with the author that would have basically made me change my mind and say, no, I'm not going to read this. In this interview, Amor Towles is talking about A Gentleman in Moscow. You know, he talks about how he loves writing about literature and setting things in this time period and why he chose to set it in a hotel. But in the caption to the photo attached to the interview, there's a little blurb that says he used the country and time period as atmosphere rather than true immersive setting. And it really shows, and it detracts from this book so much. It's really disappointing because I've read a lot of I've read historical fiction that draws you in with the setting as a true aspect of the book. Memoirs of a Geisha does that phenomenally. And that's because the author, Arthur Golden, did his research and made it an important part of this book, made it an important part of the character. So Memoirs of a Geisha is a book about a Japanese woman being sold basically as a prostitute. And instead of becoming a prostitute, she becomes a geisha instead. And it's her story. It's her journey of living as a geisha. Arthur Golden is neither a Japanese woman nor a geisha. And yet he was able to write one of the most compelling stories I've ever read. How is he able to do that? Because he did his research. Because he recognized that the setting was important to this story and was important to the characters and the message he was trying to send by writing this book. I believe he spent a year studying with other geisha, listening to them, hearing their stories, learning about their traditions before he even began to put pen on paper. And that is something I respect. That is the level of dedication to historical setting that I was expecting from this book, and I did not get it. And it leaves a sour taste in my mouth. So overall, this book from me gets a rating of 5 out of 10. It's a fine book. It's okay. It's not deep, in my opinion. Maybe some people will really enjoy it. It depends on how much literature they've read, how much historical fiction in particular, and what kind. But I also think it depends on how they feel about the aristocracy in literature. Now, this book relies heavily on the value and nostalgia people might find in something like an aristocratic setting. I'm not one of those people. Part of the reason it's so difficult for me to read classic literature is because a lot of that has a focus on the aristocracy and nobility that seems to provide inherent value and nostalgia to those high positions of power. People seem to really want to be part of that circle. And so people who do want to be part of that higher circle and wish they could be in that position are going to enjoy this more. I don't care about that. I never found that way of life interesting or desirable. And so a lot of this book's charm is lost on me. Other people who do like that sort of thing will probably find this book very charming as well as interesting. But if you want to read this to learn more about the history of this period in Russia, do not pick this up. You will be sorely disappointed. Well, thanks for listening to this book review. Like I said, I've got 2 more following. And those will be up relatively soon. I imagine these are all going to be coming up at the same time. But thanks for eavesdropping, and I'll see you next time.